Welcome into the midweek mailbag show presented to you by Fantasy Points. My name is Nick Skrip. I am your host in this show every single week where I take questions from either Twitter or our community Discord at Fantasy Points and answer them here. We have some great questions heading into week 12, Thanksgiving week. Got some great football, things to be excited for, getting very close to those fantasy playoffs. So addressing roster needs, and answering some of these questions are going to be crucial for fantasy managers out there. So hopefully this stream will help you guys out. If you are not a subscriber to Fantasy Points, this is a big reason why to be one, because through this Fantasy Points subscriber Discord, you get the chance to ask questions on this specific show, but also there's a daily interaction between the Fantasy Points staff and the community Discord subscribers. So great place to be on top of everything else you get from a Fantasy Points subscription. So all of the questions today, our Discord subscribers have asked, so we'll get through those right now. So the first one, Nori1 asks, do you think Rachaad White will replace Fournette and become the top running back at Tampa Bay? Or will they use both running backs going forward? So good question there, especially with the Buccaneers coming off of a bye and us really not knowing how this backfield is going to operate. So Fournette last game had some sort of hip injury. He looks to be ready for week 12. Obviously, pay attention to that. Having the bye week in week 11 was a benefit to him. Week 10, though, Fournette had 15 touches on 29% of the snaps. White had 22 touches and 64% of the snaps, which was obviously a season high for him. A touchdown separated the two guys. Fournette had a touchdown, so he had a better fantasy day at the end of the day. The Bucks play Cleveland. I wouldn't be surprised if Rachaad White out-touches Fournette, specifically if he's not 100% in this game. If he's not 100%, it just makes sense when two guys were getting work last time that the healthier guy gets the bulk of the work. But you have to, again, pay attention to what's going to be going on there. White's usage is trended up. Prior to week 9, he had 4 games of like 35 to 43% of the snaps. So he's been involved. Fournette has had some weeks of heavy receiving usage. Weeks 3 through 6, he had at least 6 targets in all of those games with 3 receiving touchdowns during that span. Tampa Bay may not have been the most healthy during that time, but him and Brady have a connection that was evident last season with the usage Fournette had in that passing game. But it's tough to trust Fournette right now. I think it's trending in Rachaad White's direction, but I'm leaning the side that both guys are going to end up getting work, probably rest of season. I prefer Rachaad White this week versus Cleveland. I think he's going to have a slight edge on Lenny, but I think rest of season, I give Leonard Fournette the slight edge, just knowing that he's probably the guy that's going to be scoring the touchdowns out of the two. Let's say both guys are getting work. I feel like maybe Rachaad White ends up leading the team in carries, but Fournette maybe touchdowns and receptions. So to me, in PPR leagues, I kind of lean that way. But the number one thing with all of this, it's all speculation right now. You guys wondering this and me answering it, I'm speculating too. But the number one thing is to pay attention to any reports that come out from beat reporters for the Tampa Bay Buccaneers or any kind of coach statements. You know, sometimes a coaching staff confront certain things, but a lot of times guys are upfront about how they're going to address a certain situation. So pay attention to that as we get closer to week 12. Pay attention to Leonard Fournette's injury news as well. Next question, Crypto Guerrero. Who is a tight end that may still be on waivers you think can be a good play rest of season? So streaming tight ends is something a lot of people do if they didn't want to invest early in their drafts for a tight end. Through time, some guys that were once streamers become fully rostered, and some guys that were really good end up dropping off and being waiver guys, and some guys are on a constant rotation. I want to talk about Juwan Johnson. Last time I checked, yesterday, so Monday, he was rostered in 31% of sleeper redraft leagues, so he's still widely available. I said before about Juwan Johnson, he's giving me 2020 Robert Tonyan vibes as this big touchdown threat. Tonyan had 11 that season in 2020, and Johnson has had 5 touchdowns across his last 5 games. So he's got 6 games to go. He's on pace to do the same thing. Targets fluctuate for him. 5 games of 5+ targets, but 6 games under that mark. He's on a hot streak, though, right now. Week 7 through 11, he's scored the third most fantasy points for tight ends, 13 fantasy points per game during that stretch. Meaning, if you don't have an elite option, he could have been your tight end, giving you a push for all of these weeks, week 7 through 11. So, again, third most fantasy points during that stretch in total. Not many fantasy tight ends are averaging 13 points per game. He has been during the stretch. So I would ride the hot hand and go with Juwan Johnson, especially seeing the touchdown upside, the fairly consistent fantasy scoring that he's shown us. Next question, Cub. Do we think Swift will be getting more touches? He looks healthy. So I'm a huge Swift truther, and it's been frustrating for sure. Here's the snap percentage and touches the last 4 games for Swift after returning from injury. So snap percentage and touches being rushing attempts plus receptions. So week 8, 55% in 10 touches. Week 9, 16% in 5 touches. Week 10, 31% in 7 touches. Week 11, 31% in 8 touches. So not ideal, all right, with that, especially seeing the snap percentage go down after week 10, or I'm sorry, after week 8. The touches are 10 or less in all of these. Not good, especially if you invested in DeAndre Swift this season. He's been saved from these horrible fantasy days by 3 touchdowns total during this span. Justin Jackson has had more touches and a higher snap percentage in week 11, with Jamal Williams leading the way still. So even more frustrations. I'm a firm believer in the talent of DeAndre Swift. I see this situation, though. It's a 4-6 Detroit Lions team that has no need to force him into tons of action, especially if he's been banged up not only this season, but last season as well. Not saying I agree to that. And I'm not saying that's what I would do. I'm not saying that it's not frustrating to not see him out there, but putting myself in the coaching staff's shoes, I guess I can make some sense out of it. So it's tough to trust Swift in lineups right now. He's projected like 8-ish fantasy points in PPR leagues. Hold, right? Pivot if you need to. If you have some depth, maybe you take him out of your lineup right now. My hope is that come fantasy playoffs, he is back to getting work that will make him fantasy relevant. And if so, we will forget about this spell of games that he wasn't. But if not, then it was smart of you to pivot up into that time. So that's the big hope here, is that maybe he's going to get a little bit, and then we see a switch just because he's fully healthy and he's an asset in the fantasy playoffs. But as of right now, it's hard to trust him. GoHawks07 asks, I roster both Keenan Allen and Josh Palmer. Going forward, start both, or which one if Williams is out? So we'll pick one here because I don't think it's necessarily the right move to start both guys unless you're like decimated at the wide receiver position. But I'm guilty myself of dropping Josh Palmer in a shorter bench redraft with the return of Keenan Allen and Mike Williams, just for him to catch 8 receptions of 10 targets for 106 receiving yards, 2 touchdowns, 30.6 fantasy points, his best performance in his 2-season career, Josh Palmer. That was a prime example of maybe, holding and seeing how things looked, because we figured, Keenan Allen's back, Mike Williams is back. Now Josh Palmer's like the third option. A lot of people dropped him. A lot of people benched him. Mike Williams got banged up yet again. So, Keenan Allen has been banged up all season. He had a setback with that hamstring issue during their bye week, which was frustrating. He played 68% of the snaps on his return, so that shows he wasn't maybe at 100%, but it's good to see him back in the mix. He still had 8 targets, Keenan Allen. He caught 5 of them for 94 yards, so that's a pretty decent day. I think the misconception when it comes to Keenan Allen is that he might be old and injury prone, when in reality he's played 16 games from 2017 through 2021, with the exception of 14 in 2020. So he's played a majority of his games for many years now. So yes, he is older. He's had a rough season, but let's not create a narrative that's not necessarily true when it comes to Keenan Allen. 2020 and 2021 with Justin Herbert as the primary quarterback, Keenan Allen has had 157 and 147 targets, 1,138 receiving yards, and then 992 in that 14-game season. 6 and 8 touchdowns. 16.1 and 17.5 points per game the last 2 seasons. So Palmer has had some solid games, but he's also had some pretty iffy performances as well, even with having the extended role. I do like him, Josh Palmer, with Mike Williams out, but it's Keenan Allen, who's had a good history of fantasy success through time. I think Keenan Allen at 100% is the guy that you're going to want in your lineups, but both are good guys to roster. Next question, Boston Sam. Should I go with Geno, Tom, or Garoppolo going forward? If it's not Tom, I will likely drop him on waiver wire for the first time in our league since 2001. So let's take a look at these three quarterbacks. So Tampa Bay's receiving core looks healthy for once, pending Fournette right now. That's a big plus for Tom Brady. He even has Julio Jones scoring touchdowns for him right now, on top of what he gets from Mike Evans and Chris Godwin. Jimmy Garoppolo just had a great game. Love the yards after catch boost he gets from Debo, Brandon Ayuk, George Kittle, and Christian McCaffrey. Fairly consistent in points per game. He's getting you somewhere between like 15-ish to like 17-ish points. I think he's right around 16 points per game. He's pretty consistent. He's got a pretty safe floor, but he's not going to win you matchups. It's Geno for me, though. Surprise, surprise. But we have to give this guy credit for everything he's done this season. Here's Geno Smith versus the quarterback position. Number 7 in passing yards. Number 6 in passing touchdowns. Number 7 in yards per attempt. And then via player profiler, number 1 in true completion percentage. Number 2 in play action completion percentage. And number 2 in clean pocket completion percentage. So good metrics in passing yards, passing touchdowns, yards per attempt, and very accurate metrics on top of that. QB7 overall right now for fantasy. He's averaging 18.68 points per game. We can focus on what matches are to come and what the schedule looks like rest of season, but we have to credit all the things he's done and the connection he's obviously established with DK Metcalf and Tyler Lockett. So 49ers, Kansas City, and Jets. That's the 3 games in the fantasy playoffs. It's 2 tougher matchups. And in the middle of that, those 2 tougher games is Kansas City, who is a pretty good matchup. But I'd roster 2 quarterbacks for safety through the playoffs if you are able to, just to have that cushion, I think. If you had 3 of these guys, you want to drop one of them. If not, if you just want to roll with one, I think it's Geno, just based off of a 11-week sample size of football right now and what he's done for Seattle. Last question here. I think it's Pee Wee. Is it time to be rostering handcuffs, backup tight ends, backup quarterbacks? How do you balance picking up the potential breakout players versus insurance players? Also, what do you do with your time if you're out of the playoffs? If you're out of the playoffs, I'm going to start with that one. If you're out of the playoffs, you don't have to maybe play the waiver wire as much, but still set your lineups and compete. You can still give your buddy some crap for, I was being nice with my words, some crap for beating him, right? You paid for the league most likely, so like just still play. It's still fun to check your lineup, watch the games, and see how your guys are doing. I know it means a lot less, but at the same time, if you paid for something, might as well just play, right? And still set your lineups and watch football and enjoy it. But the rest of this here, you can likely get away with 1 tight end and then stream 1 in the worst case scenario for your average redraft league. So this is, pending that you have a solid tight end rest of season. If you don't, you're still probably streaming guys on a cycle anyways. But I don't think you have to roster 2 tight ends. The only time I think I would is if you already do, and come playoff time, you don't want to release one of those guys to waivers for your league mates to pick up. Like, for example, I play in a redraft league where I have both like Gerald Everett and Pat Freiermuth. I don't want to drop one of those guys for anybody because I feel like I would give somebody else a boost who might not have a good tight end right now. And maybe you say, well, those guys are not like top 3 guys, but at the same time, somebody might be able to have use of that. So I'll hold. But otherwise, I don't think you have to like go and grab, trying to think of a random example. I mentioned Juwan Johnson. If I have like Dalton Schultz, I don't think I need to roster Juwan Johnson. I mean, it kind of depends on your roster. As far as handcuffs, running backs on good offenses that are available are appealing to me. Waiver wire shows have focused this week on Samaje Perine and James Cook, two running backs on some of the better scoring offenses that gives them some fantasy upside. So, like, those make sense to me. I don't mind this route, and it's dependent on who that backup is. Those are two examples. We've seen the big days out of guys like Madison. That's always a good one just because we've seen it before. So what comes to mind with this is, hey, they're on a good offense, or we've seen it in the past. I mean, Madison's on a good offense as well, but those are some factors. But I don't think it makes a ton of sense to with a smaller bench to waste it on like Keontae Ingram from Arizona or Chuba Hubbard from the Panthers or Dare or Burkhead from the Texans, Amir Abdullah from the Raiders. I don't think you have to roster and make sure every backup is rostered. I feel like, some of those guys don't really profile as somebody that's going to be this workhorse and score you 15 fantasy points if the starter goes down. So that's kind of like how I try to look at it sometimes when it comes to the running back position. If we've learned anything, though, from waivers the past week, we should be rostering rookies with upside. George Pickens was early on in the season. He showed us some upside. People ran and got him off the waivers pretty early. Christian Watson, after week 10, was a big waiver wire push guy. Treylon Burks this past week for the waivers this week, heading into week 12. Everybody is going to try and get him if he's available. So this makes me think guys that are widely available that didn't have a breakout game recently, we should try to roster. So Jahan Dotson, who's awesome at the beginning of the season, he's widely available. Jameson Williams is returning from injury. Maybe he's not a factor right away, but maybe he's a factor in the fantasy playoffs. Go grab him and stash him. Sky Moore, it depends. I haven't historically been a huge Sky Moore guy, but this wide receiver room was banged up in Kansas City, and he saw 6 targets. So maybe he's a guy we just stashed for now. One of the biggest factors at the end of the day with all of this is what your roster looks like. Are you deep at running back? Then maybe you don't need to have one of those handcuffs. Are you hurting, in the running back position? Then maybe you do go and grab a handcuff and hope that he falls into some work. Are you struggling at the wide receiver position? Then you can take your shots on upside potential wide receivers like some of the rookies I just mentioned, or anybody else that's still kind of like floating on waivers, maybe like a Nico Collins. Maybe you're like, man, my wide receiver room is poor. I focus on running backs and a strong tight end. I need somebody who's going to have some upside. Then maybe you go and grab a guy like Nico or this past week, Donovan Peoples-Jones, like guys like that are floating out there. So very dependent on what your roster looks like. I feel like people try to generalize this strategy saying, make sure you pick up handcuff running backs, make sure you pick up all the rookies, make sure you pick up anybody who has, receiving yard upside, things like that. But it's always roster dependent and what is going to help you be a better team in the fantasy playoffs. Enough said. So thank you guys for tuning into the show. If you are tuning in and you are not a subscriber of Fantasy Points, get that done today. You can use a promo code P2W22 for a discount. Well worth it. Tons of stuff going on the site. Tons of content coming out on a daily basis from Fantasy Points. Good luck this week, week 12, in your matchups. Have a great Thanksgiving as well. Catch you guys next week.